The Innocence Project estimates somewhere between 2.3 and 5% of all prisoners in the US are innocent. That's between 43,000 and 100,000 people sitting behind bars for crimes they never committed. Now, each one of those people has a story, but today we're going to be focusing on one of them. This is Inside Out. Today, we're diving into the tragic and controversial case of Melissa Lucio in Texas, a woman who has spent over a decade of her life in prison for a crime she may not have committed. And what's so crazy about her case is she actually admitted to the crime. So how did we get here where so many people think she may actually be innocent?
Pictures, if I beat you half to death, like that little child was beat, I bet you'd die too.
Tonight, we break down the case of Melissa Lucio.
Melissa Lucio.
Melissa Lucio.
Melissa Lucio's.
I first reported on Melissa's case for Vice News back in 2022 when Vice was still around. And I was shocked back then at just how little evidence there was to support Melissa's conviction. Since then, the judge who presided over Melissa's original trial has recommended that the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturns her conviction and death sentence, saying that she might be actually innocent. But that doesn't necessarily mean Melissa's in the clear. The recommendation from the judge is just that, a recommendation, and it's still up to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals to decide if Melissa's case will be overturned. I think Melissa's case is indicative of so many issues in our criminal legal system, which is why I wanted to get into her case today.
My name is Melissa Elizabeth Lucio. I'm 48 years old. I've been on death row 11 years.
To understand Melissa's case, we need to take a short look at her life before the conviction. It's a story filled with trauma, abuse, and hardship, circumstances that played a major role in what she would later be accused of. Her father passed away when she was very young, and so her mother moved her to the Rio Grande Valley in Texas. According to Melissa's court records, her mother then found a new boyfriend who sexually abused Melissa, and this is just the beginning of Melissa's traumatic story.
Because of this incident, I continue to be molested by other family members. I just allowed myself to be a victim over and over again.
Melissa was then married off as a child bride at 16 years old to an alcoholic and physically abusive man. She gave birth to 5 children with him, and then he abandoned her to leave her as a single mother with 5 kids. Melissa's next husband then carried on the cycle of abuse that defined most of Melissa's childhood. He beat and berated her and the children. During this marriage, Melissa gave birth to 7 more children. Throughout this time, Melissa and her children were often homeless, scraping by in the toughest of conditions. By 35, after years of physical and emotional abuse, Melissa was struggling with addiction herself and a vast array of mental illnesses. Because of this, she had been investigated by the Child Protective Services, as she would often leave the youngest children in the care of the oldest children, which is considered a form of neglect. But even in the thousands of pages of reports from Child Protective Services, Melissa was never accused of using any physical violence against any of her children. The purpose of this added context about Melissa's early life will become clearer later on. But for now, all you need to remember is that up until this point, Melissa's relationships with men had been plagued by abuse and violence. The event that changed everything happened on February 15th, 2007. Melissa and her family were moving to a new apartment. One of Melissa's daughters, Mariah, had a physical disability. One of her feet were turned in, which caused her to wobble while she was walking. In fact, her preschool had reported many falls and injuries because of this. On that day, Melissa says while the family were moving apartments, Mariah fell down a steep staircase.
She fell all the way down. From the first step up there all the way down here.
Melissa said that at first, Mariah's injuries didn't seem life-threatening, so Melissa didn't take her to the emergency room. But 2 days later, Mariah went down for a nap and tragically never woke up. And this was just the beginning of the nightmare for Melissa. Just 2 hours after Mariah's death, and while Melissa was still in shock from the loss of her daughter, police took her in for questioning. 2 male police officers then interrogated Melissa for several hours.
They just kept pointing fingers at me and threatening me and telling me that I was going to spend the rest of my life in prison and that I wasn't going to be able to see the rest of my children grow up and get married. And, you know, they just kept throwing so many words at me, and the interrogation continued for maybe six, 7 hours until 3 o'clock in the morning.
Melissa, already emotionally and physically drained from just losing her child, was then bullied, yelled at, berated, and pressured to admit guilt.
You know something is wrong.
No, sir, I don't.
If I bring you all those pictures, if I beat you half to death, like that little child was beat, I bet you'd die too.
Sir, I did not beat my daughter, sir.
No?
Not that cruel to my children.
What are those bruises on your little child?
And after hours of this, something terrible happened.
I just told him I'm responsible for Mariah's bruises.
Melissa finally broke down and said, "I guess I did it." This confession was then used by the prosecution to convict Melissa and sentence her to death. Unfortunately, as sad as Melissa's case is, she is not alone in this situation. Melissa's case is far from unique. False confessions forced through aggressive police tactics are one of the leading causes of wrongful convictions in the United States. And here's another example. Did you guys ever hear about the Central Park 5? Maybe you watched Ava DuVernay's heartbreaking recreation of the case on Netflix called When They See Us. If you haven't, then you absolutely should go and watch that. But just in case, let me give you a little refresher on the Central Park 5 case. 5 Black and Latino young boys were falsely accused of the brutal assault of a woman in Central Park in 1989. Now, the racist reasons for the police rushing to convict these 5 young boys is a topic for a different video. What we're mostly concerned with is how the police went after these boys, because the similarities to Melissa's case are undeniable.
What did you do? Who were you with? Who did you come with?
The tone was very scary. I felt like they might take us to the back of the precinct and kill us.
You're not gonna go home until you give up a story.
The police interrogated these young boys for hours, using intimidation, psychological pressure to force them into admitting to something they hadn't done. In fact, their confessions didn't even match the facts of the case.
And they put pressure on him, a lot of pressure. He was slapped around. And it is our contention that whatever statements he made were the product of psychological and physical coercion.
Law enforcement used physical intimidation like banging on the table, psychological pressure, and pitting them against one another to force these young boys to confess to a crime they never committed. These coerced confessions led to a wrongful conviction, and the boys, despite having their DNA excluded from the scene and zero evidence linking them to the crime, were sentenced to long prison terms and ended up serving over 40 years between them before being proven innocent.
Sodomy in the first degree, sexual abuse in the first degree, attempted murder in the second degree.
That's 40 years of life lost because they were pressured into admitting something that they never did. The aggressive and coercive interrogation techniques employed by police in Melissa and the Central Park 5 case are notorious for producing false confessions. Experts show that the Central Park 5 were more susceptible to these techniques because of their young age. Juveniles are between 2 and 3 times more likely to falsely confess during police interrogations. And Melissa Lucio, as a trauma survivor, was also far more susceptible to these interrogation tactics, especially because of her history with men and her fragile emotional state having just lost her child. One of the police officers that interrogated Melissa testified during the trial that Melissa's slumped posture, passivity, and failure to make eye contact told him right there and then that she was the one who did it. But psychologists who assessed Melissa at the time said that her response to the interrogations was just what you would predict from someone who was a trauma survivor, and that Melissa shared zero characteristics common with women who had murdered their children. These psychologists wanted to testify in court that Melissa's reaction was totally normal for a woman who had endured a lifetime of abuse. Yet they weren't allowed to testify in court. Melissa's defense counsel were extremely unprepared for the trial and ineffective throughout the trial. The jury never learned about the extent of Melissa's history of child sexual abuse and domestic violence, nor how these experiences may have led her to a false admission of guilt. And finally, in my opinion, the most convincing evidence to suggest Melissa did not kill Mariah was that her other children were interviewed and corroborated the story of Mariah falling down those stairs. None of the children said they had been told what to say or said they had ever been hit by Melissa.
Well, I saw one bruise when she fell down steps.
Where did she have it? Where did you see it?
I think there was one on her eye. I think on her arm too. That was my mom and my daddy.
You missed them?
One of the reasons for the rush to judgment in Melissa's case was that the district attorney at the time was seeking re-election. He rushed to prosecute Melissa for the murder of Mariah without any evidence, because as a district attorney, he was running on the fact that he would be tough on crime.
So I seek your vote for United States Congress.
And what better way to show that than going after a baby killer? Except now we know that that district attorney was in fact corrupt, as he's now facing a 13-year federal prison sentence for bribery and extortion. Melissa's case is a stark reminder of how the criminal legal system can fail, especially for vulnerable women of color and those without the resources to aggressively fight convictions. The system rushed to judgment, ignored key evidence, and used coercion to secure a false confession. Melissa has already lost over a decade of her life to a crime she may not have committed.
Even though I did hear the word guilty, I didn't want to accept it. I think the best way to describe it is I felt like I was in a dream, and then I would wake up and I would be at home with my kids.
Initially, Melissa had an execution set for April of 2022, but luckily that was stayed, which means there was a pause put on her execution for now.
Good. Have you heard the news?
No, what?
You haven't heard the news yet?
No, what happened?
The Court of Criminal Appeals issued a stay of your execution for Wednesday.
Are you serious?
And now Melissa is still in prison and waiting for news from the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals to see if they'll accept the recommendation from her original trial judge, or if they'll stick to their guns and refuse to admit that the system may have failed her. Luckily, Melissa has some pretty powerful people in her corner. Kim Kardashian has been a vocal advocate for Melissa's case, and Melissa's case and possible innocence was explored on a Hulu documentary called The State of Texas versus Melissa, both of which garnered massive attention for her case. If you want to find out more about Melissa's case, you can go to the Innocence Project. I will put their link in the description of the video, or watch the incredible documentary on Hulu. And let me know what you think about Melissa's case.